This podcast is made possible through listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. And the Florence County Museum, presenting Edward Gay, an American landscape painter, chronicling Gay's evolving style amid the turn of the 20th century and his unique connections to South Carolina and the National Academy of Design. Now through February 23rd, flocomuseum.org. And Meadow Garden, home of George Walton, one of the youngest signers of the Declaration of Independence. Open for tours Monday through Friday, 10 to 4. Learn more at historicmeadowgarden.org and visit augusta.com.
From South Carolina Public Radio, this is Walter Edgar's Journal. I'm Walter Edgar, welcoming you to our podcast series about South Carolina culture and history, with a nod to all things Southern. This week, we offer you an encore of an episode from our broadcast archive, a fascinating conversation with Dr. Vernon Burton, the Judge Matthew J. Perry Jr., Distinguished Professor of History at Clemson University, and with Dr. Peter Eisenstadt, Affiliate Scholar in the Department of History at Clemson University.
Walter will be talking with Peter and Vernon about their book, Lincoln's Unfinished Work, The New Birth of Freedom from Generation to Generation, a collection of essays from a conference that they directed at Clemson University, which discussed many of the dimensions of Lincoln's unfinished work as a springboard to explore the task of political and social reconstruction in the United States from 1865 to the present day.
The conference was not solely about Lincoln or the immediate unfinished work of Reconstruction or the broader unfinished work of America coming to terms with its tangled history of race. It investigated all three topics, as does our conversation. Gentlemen, welcome to the Journal.
Thank you. Such a pleasure to be here, Walter.
Well, let's talk about the conference, how it came about and what you all intended.
Well, I had always wanted to do a conference like this dealing with Lincoln's unfinished work. You know, in his two greatest speeches, generally considered, the Gettysburg Address and the second inaugural, Lincoln spoke of the unfinished work. And for me, that had always been the unfinished work in race and race relations in America. So I had always wanted to do a conference exploring that meaning and to encourage people, let's finish this work that Lincoln called upon us to do. At that time, he said, this is the work for other people besides just the president, and calling on individuals to do it. And I thought there was no better place to do it than Clemson University, which, of course, had been founded on John C. Calhoun's plantation. And it was Clemson himself who gave the land, who had been from Pennsylvania but became Secretary of Agriculture of the Confederacy. And the most, at least that time, celebrated graduate was Strom Thurmond, who had led the Dixiecrat Party. And like with my arguments about Lincoln, which you and I have discussed before, Lincoln was not born the great emancipator, but through education, through learning, and in the broadest sense of education, he, at the end of his life, was leading the nation toward a better place on race. So I think education is central. Lincoln believed that it was central for democracy itself, and I think it is central today, and that's what we were trying to do in the conference, which included high school students and high school teachers.
All right, and speaking of education, I want to parse words. Let's look at the words that you use. Let's just take unfinished. It's got any number of definitions, does it not?
Absolutely. Peter?
Yeah, unfinished could be incomplete. It could be something a little rude. Someone's unfinished. The word that really is complicated is work. It's one of the most complicated words in the English language. If you look at the Oxford English Dictionary, there are about 360 different senses of the word work, from something physical, something mental, something having to do with physics. There are religious connotations to it. It's an incredibly complicated word. And I think when Lincoln invoked unfinished work, he was speaking about it in a number of senses. First, Lincoln was a laborer, and a job needs to be finished. If you're digging a canal or building a bridge, doing it halfway is not going to solve any problems. You have to finish the job. And I think there's also a religious, works and faith and things of that sort distinction. And I think Lincoln was drawing on all of these senses when he spoke about the unfinished work.
And the unfinished work was American democracy, the nation.
And I think if you understand Lincoln, and that's the context I was doing the conference, Lincoln once said that if he would be remembered for anything, it would be for the Emancipation Proclamation. That was his greatest accomplishment. But I think that's really, as a historian, you look at it, it is an introduction of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, which I argue is that Lincoln took the Declaration of Independence, which is sort of our mission statement, I would argue, for the United States, and put it into the Constitution, our rule book. Now, of course, particularly the 14th and 15th Amendment is after Lincoln is dead, but that's part of that unfinished work. And part of our unfinished work is to make sure that justices read the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments as just as important as the First and Second Amendment. And if you read those broadly, to read these broadly, because they are what Eric Foner, who was one of the keynotes at our conference, has called the second founding. It changes the Constitution dramatically. So that's just one narrow sort of legal definition of that unfinished work and what it is.
Well, over time, since Lincoln's death, he has been interpreted, misinterpreted, understood, misunderstood, represented, misrepresented, and you covered all of those at your conference. And there are any number of essays. I picked out a few, and I think probably my favorite, I enjoyed all of them, but I really enjoyed Lincoln's sense of humor. So let's talk about that essay for a few minutes.
Yeah, and I think it's so important. This is Richard Carradine, who's a friend of Walter's and mine, and now a friend of Peter since we've introduced him, and who has written on Lincoln's humor. But I think it's so important. Can you imagine presidents today using humor, but also the contrast to the abolitionists? It helps us understand where Lincoln was. The abolitionists were very serious. I mean, you just can't imagine abolitionists joking or telling stories. And as you know from another book, I actually argue this is part of his Southern cultural heritage and upbringing, which is a slightly different take on it. But at least according to Carradine, it certainly helped Lincoln survive the rough, tough world of politics, which he was a master at. But it was his way of self-deprecating humor often, or to try to break a silence. But it's also, I think, part of his worldview. And Peter and I were talking about this on the drive down. Peter, you want to add to some of the ideas of why we like this essay so much?
Right. As Vernon said, as I mentioned to Richard, that the idea of someone publishing the abolition of the joke book is probably not going to happen. And I think Lincoln approached the question of slavery from this perspective. And I think it reflects his religious views as well, which are complicated, but he certainly was not an evangelical Christian. His moral seriousness came out of his sense of human nature, which I think is very much reflected in his humor. And as Richard argues in this essay, it's an absolute key to, as everybody has recognized, that Lincoln had an extraordinary sense of humor. And it was a way for him to keep his head about him, particularly when he was president. It's one of his defining characteristics. And I think Richard did an excellent job in sort of dissecting its nature and its roots in popular culture at the time, the sort of joke books that he was reading and the humorists that he enjoyed, and it's quite an enlightening essay.
And can I just take a moment to add one of my favorite Lincoln stories, and one that I used to argue he was a Southerner and saw himself as a Southerner, and it gets at his humor as well. African Americans had come to petition Lincoln to meet with him to equalize the pay of black and white soldiers and particularly black workers. And there was a group, and Lincoln, as normal, liked to joke. And so he said at the time, he said, "Aha, so you want me to raise the pay of Cuffy." Now, the word Cuffy at that time was the kind of word that not quite the N word today, but pretty close to it, and it was insulting to black people. There was a young black man in this group. He was 19 years of age, and he said, "Mr. President, that is a word that is offensive to African Americans." I'm paraphrasing, of course, and we do not use it. And Lincoln, the President of the United States, first of all, it was unusual to be meeting in the White House with a group of African Americans, one of the first time, and he apologized to this 19-year-old man. He said, "I am sorry." He says, "I am by birth a Southerner, and I had no idea that this word was offensive." And that's it. But he never uses the word again. This is his education process. And 1 month later, pay was equalized. But it tells you also the seriousness and how he understands when he crosses a line and is able to sort of do something about it. So I love this particular story of Lincoln and where his humor had got out of bounds, and the result is he makes progress on things.
Well, contemporaries, particularly those New England abolitionists, they're prim and proper, treated Lincoln as a rube. His humor was considered rough, ill-mannered, but they couldn't handle him because all of a sudden he might throw Aesop back at them.
Yeah.
But I just was interested also in the fact that a lot of things are attributed to Lincoln that he never said. And I think at one point you said, other than Yogi Berra, nobody has.
Right. Well, there have been several books about misquotations. Mm-hmm. And Yogi Berra and Abraham Lincoln had the longest sections in the book about things attributed to them that they never said.
Well, and particularly Lincoln's continues, such as you'll see memes on the internet about "don't trust the internet," Abraham Lincoln, or things like that.
How did the discussion go when the paper was presented?
Well, this is a good opportunity. I don't have it right in front of us in the book. We have a website. I'm very proud of this because of Clemson doing this for me. We had the entire conference of 40 presentations videotaped, and they're now on a website, so you can actually go see it. There were 2 papers by Richard, but you can actually see the responses and everything. But, of course, this is such a good essay and about humor that it was one that sort of sparked, I think, people just like the essay and the story so much. And as you know, Richard is a great writer, as well as he also is in theater and does theater and drama. So he gave a great presentation. It was well received by everyone.
Earlier, before we got into the studio, we were talking about teaching in the schools today. Teachers were invited to attend this conference, and then you had special teacher workshops.
We did do the last day on Saturday, I believe it was December the 1st. I did the whole afternoon was a workshop for teachers in South Carolina. These teachers, particularly these public schools, are doing God's work in this state and everywhere else. And it is hard. And now the states are making it even more difficult. How do you teach about a history that's so important, but it's difficult with black and white children in the classroom? And so they were just begging for help and ways to do it. And, of course, like you said, the humor of a Lincoln is one, the idea of growth. And for me, and I think you and I have talked about this before, degree, primary sources. What did people say at the time as opposed to what we have created or even what historians have said they said? One of the things that I emphasize, let's don't tell people how to think, but let them read those documents and make their own interpretations.
When you use a primary document, it's what was said in 1808 or 1861 or 1898. It's not what Vernon Burton or Walter Edgar said it was. It's what Ben Tillman or Judge McGraw
or John C. Calhoun.
It's what they said.
And I think that's important, Walter, that we need to take them in their time, put them in context. That's what one of the important things historians do, is not just change over time, but we contextualize these sources. And we can't lose that. And I think that's important in teaching and is critical for our understanding of how government works and democracy works. And I think you and I have agreed on this before. I've often said two things changed the American South in our lifetime. One was air conditioning, the other the Voting Rights Act. And yet the way that we put the emphasis on STEM education, which I'm not denying is important, but downplay the importance of history, that we now understand better how air conditioning works than how the Voting Rights Act works or our government works.
Yeah. And the other thing about primary sources is you understand how history works and how history is written. And history is not just people sitting around offering opinions about this or that. Real history is when historians interact with sources. The sources are often ambiguous and complicated. It's not simply a matter of this happened this way. It seems to me if you can introduce and inculcate students, they're becoming, in their own way, historians. Because documents do not interpret themselves. Documents need to be read. And there's no way to do history without primary sources. Historians know that. I don't know if average people really do. So I think it's important in all sorts of ways to read primary sources.
But to get at the central issue in this era of what's become alternative facts, history as opposed to just even journalism or newspapers or certainly TV and certain stations, history has to be based in evidence and an honest evaluation of the evidence.
But let's get back to more historical documents, because documents, and we're talking about documents that Abraham Lincoln created, have been part of the story of how he's interpreted. And I'm going to the Gettysburg Address, his second inaugural, and then his letters, how his views about democracy and all Americans has been kind of skewed, particularly over about the last 50 years. You want to start off with that? Which one of you?
One of the essays by the late Jim Lowen looks at this in particular to show that when that letter is quoted, of course, it always leaves out Lincoln's explanation of why he is saying this. And this is there's a big debate on Lincoln that goes back, was Lincoln racist? And I think Lincoln would say, yes, I am, as everybody else probably was, but that he was motivated about preserving the Union and didn't really care about what happened to enslaved people or freedom. And the letter's always quoted, if the section where he says, if I could win this war by freeing all the people, I would. If I could preserve the Union, that is, win the war by continuing slavery, I would, or, a combination. So that's always used as one of there are like three things I've traced out over time as sort of the big criticisms of Lincoln, where Lincoln went from the great emancipator to the great white honky, particularly among some groups of historians and others.
Now, when he wrote that letter to Greeley, Horace Greeley, right, Emancipation Proclamation was already in the works.
And that's exactly where I was going. Not only in the works, he had a draft of it in his desk. He's already discussed it with his cabinet in other months before, and they were convinced that he needed to wait to a time when it did not look like the Union was losing. And that's why he waits to after Antietam, which I'm not sure it was a Union victory, but at least it was close to a draw. And his commitment, as he told people, that God had given him a sign that this is what he was going to do. And he becomes to believe in this very much. And it was a very actually brave thing to do, because he was told by his very best friend that if you do the Emancipation Proclamation, in fact, if you don't negate it after it was done, then Kentucky will go with the Confederacy. So once he made that decision, stuck by, and once black soldiers fought, when they fought for the Union, for Lincoln, that was the line that if you fought for your country, and from there on, he begins to argue that. But I also say it's an example of where he was. He was a master politician. Why did he do this? Because he was trying to bring the country to where he was. He published this letter in a conservative paper so it would reach the other people that may not listen to him otherwise. Sort of a lesson to us today about the different newscasts. We pick the station we want to listen to, but he was trying to reach these other people, and it was his process of bringing them along on race. And he does exactly the same thing at the end of his life about black citizenship and black voting.
Okay. Peter, one of the other documents that comes up about Lincoln and race were his comments during a debate in Charleston, Illinois, in an election campaign, which on the face of them are racist in flashing red letters.
Yes, I don't think it's one of the high points in Lincoln's career, those statements. It was said in the south of Illinois, which was a fairly conservative place. And as Vernon said, it's one of the statements held up against Lincoln for his racism. Many people have said, we covered this briefly in the afterword, that the remarkable thing about Lincoln was his capacity for growth and learning. And wherever he was in 1858, I think he really grew during his presidency. And we say in the afterwards, we call it Lincoln's unfinished work, but it's not his unfinished work alone. I think Lincoln experienced during the war the plight of black people, the experience of slavery, speaking to people like Frederick Douglass and others, and I think he learned and he grew. And it's famous people like Frederick Douglass, anonymous, formerly enslaved people who ran away. It's the unfinished work of America. And Lincoln obviously was in a position to do more about it than anybody else because of virtue of his office. But the new birth of freedom, as Lincoln called it, coming out of the Civil War, was by no means, came out of Lincoln's head like Athena. It was an organic thing that developed during the Civil War.
One of the people that Lincoln was influenced by was none other than the great hero of South Carolina, Robert Smalls, later congressman, the man who introduced the bill that brings public education to South Carolina. And when he meets with Lincoln, Lincoln says to Robert Smalls, "Why did you risk your life and that of your family and your men and their families to sail the planter, that is the boat, out of Charleston Harbor under the eyes of the Confederacy?" And Smalls gives him a one-word answer: freedom, which is exactly what Lincoln says a year later in The New Birth of Freedom. And I think there's a real correlation there that goes back to Robert Smalls of South Carolina.
Well, I just think that, and I can remember the historians I've read over my 50 years who pick up on several of these things and say, well, Lincoln really was a true blue Southerner. He really didn't like black people. The Emancipation was a sham, but they forget what else was said. And we've already talked about the Gettysburg Address. People used to memorize that. Mm-hmm. My father, even growing up in a southern town, they memorized the Gettysburg Address. And many Southerners would say, and you will address this too, well, had Lincoln lived, Reconstruction would have been different.
In the second inaugural, Lincoln was called out on this at the time and criticized it because several people understood exactly where he was going when he said that those who had fought for the Union and given their lives, that their widows and children would be taken care of. And he is including those black soldiers and women and children. So that is recognizing them as citizens.
But it took the three amendments,
That's right.
the so-called Reconstruction amendments, to make that a reality.
So Walter, I'm glad you mentioned the question of counterfactual history. And I want to point out, most of this book is not really about Lincoln. Most of the book is about the unfinished work. And most of the book really is after 1865. And it's what happened, what should have happened in America, and the essays go up to the very recent past. One of the points that Vernon and I make in the afterword, we argue that if you want to pick a central year in American history, 1877 might be as good as any, recognizing that, of course, Reconstruction really did not end in 1 year, and that if you want to see the defining event, I think, in the next 150 years plus of American history, it's the destruction of Reconstruction and the failure of Reconstruction and determined effort that really set in place the future course of American history in terms of race, to some extent in terms of labor, in terms of a whole range of things. It's one of the points we make that historians today, or a number of historians today, assume too quickly that Reconstruction was doomed to failure because white racism was so thick, so incorrigible that there was no alternative. And I guess we argue that that did not have to be the case. And you end up arguing, how history might have been different. We say in the afterword, everywhere in the Western Hemisphere after emancipation, in the West Indies, in Cuba, it was disappointing. Formerly enslaved people did not achieve what they wanted in the aftermath of emancipation. But I think nowhere in the Western Hemisphere were anticipation so high as in the American South, and the results ended being so completely disappointing. The problem with counterfactual is you don't know what happened, but I think there are reasons to think that Reconstruction could have been different, and I think Vernon probably wants to add something here.
Everyone is fascinated by the Civil War. People look for the identity of America in the Civil War. And that's understandable when you think about how many people lost their lives, Americans, on both sides. And also it dealt with the issue that we struggle with still today. What is the role of people who are perceived as different? We might call it multiculturalism today. But I really think the identity of America, and what Pete and I have argued, is if it's not in Reconstruction, I really don't believe you can separate Civil War and Reconstruction, but if it's not there, it's hammered out during Reconstruction. I do not believe that Reconstruction really failed in a broader sense because it laid the foundations so that Benjamin E. May's parents talked to him about Robert Smalls and the black and the hopes of Reconstruction. But you see that belief and sort of highlight of Reconstruction, and though it's, I think, unfortunately not studied enough or emphasized enough, I think it is probably the most important period in American history, and certainly in South Carolina was one of the most progressive periods of history, certainly the Constitution, the introduction of public schools, the building of roads, trying to use tax money to build infrastructure and support the people of the state, and brings out the very issues that we deal with today in Congress. What is the role of the state?
And actually, the 1868 Constitution, the only one adopted by a vote of the people, brought home rule to the counties.
That's right.
So, but when I was in grad school, there was a wonderful old curmudgeon, Professor William Foran, who taught Southern history. And it was a question on my comps. He said, how many Reconstructions have there been in America? Well, he talked about that. Obviously, we're talking about the period that was then defined ending at 1877. He considered the New Deal in terms of the South a Reconstruction. And we were entering the civil rights era in the late 1960s. And he said, this is going to be another Reconstruction?
So we quote people, as early as the 1940s, people were talking about a second Reconstruction. There have been books on second Reconstruction, third Reconstruction, fourth, it's like world wars, right? Like but yes, and I think, what is the Reconstruction? It's like starting again, building again, has not died. And the idea that America can right itself remains strong. The Dunning schools saw Reconstruction as an aberration. I think some recent historians are doing it the same, turning it on its head. It's saying that white racism made Reconstruction a unique period, and white racism sort of wreaked its toll on, which is true. And I think what we're trying to say is Reconstruction is part of the unfinished work of America, and every generation has to sort of try to reconstruct America. And it's an incredibly potent idea that, remains central to, I think, the unfinished work of freedom.
Mm-hmm. Somehow Faulkner came to mind about the past. The past is not past.
People forget, and why it's so central, I think, that students take history both in high school and college, is we are here because we were somewhere else before, and how did we get to where we are, and why it's not a blueprint for the future. You can learn from it and try not to make the same mistakes, or at least be aware of the context of how you're moving forward, because yesterday is history.
Now I'm going to cycle back to what you were talking about. Was Reconstruction a failure or not? Because one of the things that did not end in 1877 was, and that was particularly true in South Carolina, of formerly enslaved persons becoming property owners.
Right. It's a pretty powerful essay in there, I thought. I really liked that particular essay.
In South Carolina, and it was interesting, particularly in the Low Country, and I know that Bernie Powers and others have addressed this, but one of the ironies was that the enslaved persons in the Low Country rice plantations who worked under the task system were used to plotting what needed to be done, and they were the ones who began to purchase land as soon as it was available.
One of our favorite essays in the book by Adrian Petty and Mark Schultz that talked about the question you're just raising about black land ownership in both Reconstruction South. And the figures are quite startling for people who assume that, with the failure of 40 acres and a mule, that all blacks were sharecroppers. Their figures from 1910 show that on the average about a quarter of all black farmers own their own land. In South Carolina, the percentage was 21%. In some states, I think particularly in the Upper South, it was particularly higher. Virginia was 67%. Missouri was 57%. And it's really startling to think of that sort of history. And black landowners often were cores of community. They kept alive traditions of independence. It's an important way to rethink the history of the post-Reconstruction South, which is not to say that it wasn't as horrible for black people as current history indicates, but that despite that, blacks were able to do everything they could to protect their independence, create their own livelihoods for themselves. And black land ownership is a key part of that.
You mentioned Benjamin Mays earlier from Greenwood. His family were landowners. In fact, there were a large number of African-American landowners in Greenwood County and at least one organized black community. And Peter, what you're talking about is not just the land ownership, but all aspects of life. Between 1877 and 1890 in South Carolina, you had two different communities side by side. You had black churches, you had black cultural organizations. African Americans, at least in this state, pretty much withdrew into themselves as they were excluded from the political world. They created a separate world. Of course, the whole question of land ownership goes back to Sherman's decree of 40 acres and a mule. Because that didn't happen, people think that black land ownership did not, and it varied from state to state.
I have an essay in the book on Jackie Robinson and his understanding of integration. One of the key aspects of his early life, he was born in southern Georgia, was he came from a family of landowners. And his mother's family owned their own land, and they were AME church members. It gave Jackie Robinson, as he writes about, a sense of resourcefulness, a sense that he was not defeated. Now, mind you, he left Georgia for Pasadena, California when he was about a year and a half old, so he really didn't have any memory of growing up in the South. But it's just another example of how black land ownership, even indirectly and even in places like California, could play a key role in shaping people's personalities. For Jackie Robinson, it was the sense of belonging to America, believing that there was nothing, his conception of integration was citizenship. He understood integration as demand for citizenship. It was not really about inclusion. It was important to, for the Dodgers and other major league teams to hire black players, but that wasn't integration as he understood it. And he certainly wasn't alone. It was the demand for full citizenship. This is what I write about in my essay, but I think we can connect it to some of these things coming out of Reconstruction, where African Americans demanded to be full citizens of the United States, and they had to bide their time after 1880 and 90. But when the situation changed, for various reasons in the 1930s and 40s, they were ready and demanded their full citizenship.
And I really like what Pete does in his essay, in particular, to explain what integration meant when it becomes important. I will just say that Jackie Robinson's concept of integration is basically what Lincoln was arguing about citizenship as well, I think, in terms of that citizenship rights.
We really haven't touched on the three constitutional amendments much. And Peter, that's really your area. You want to take that?
It's more Vernon than mine, but Eric Foner has an essay in the book that's drawn on a book he recently published centered on the three Civil War and Reconstruction amendments. Mm-hmm. The 14th Amendment is absolutely, I think, the key amendment that came out of Reconstruction. And when we speak of how Reconstruction could have come differently, I mean, certainly part of it, and Vernon wrote about this eloquently in his recent book with Armin Derfner, is about how the Supreme Court, almost immediately after its passage, restricted and narrowed the meaning of the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act. It took a century for the 14th Amendment to realize its breadth and scope during the 60s. It's really unfortunate that over the past decade, the most important fruit of that, the Voting Rights Act, has been eviscerated in various Supreme Court decisions, and we don't know what its future is. But yeah, the new birth of freedom that Lincoln was speaking about, I think, was translated concretely most in the Civil War amendments.
80% of all cases shows you where the 14th Amendment has gone and our misunderstanding of it, because it was clearly, of course, to give citizenship rights to the formerly enslaved and African American. 80% of all cases involve corporations, since corporations have become persons. And I'll just give a plug for a good thing Ben Tillman did when Citizens United overturned what was called the Tillman Act, because Ben Tillman had, at the time, the large corporations were not Microsoft or Facebook, but it was the railroads. And Tillman had been the sponsor of the legislation that tried to keep big money out of politics.
All right. Well, that's not often mentioned in this story of Ben Tillman.
That's right.
Everybody has, just like we were talking about interpretations of Lincoln, everybody has, there's a subtext somewhere that has not.
Yeah, and I like to show those complexities. As I said, with Lincoln, he's not born the great emancipator. It goes in different directions. Not many people are aware that Lincoln studied Calhoun for how to make an argument. And Calhoun's writing, he thought he was a great writer. I might differ a little bit, but you see that relationship to South Carolina.
Well, there's one interesting essay which we really don't have time to talk about, but it does raise the issue. It's about public history on the airwaves. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to get into that so much as what the authors concluded about historians have a responsibility to the general public. I agree. But why then do historians continue to produce dense, unreadable treatises with little opportunity to cross over? I'm sorry, we've got colleagues who produce very narrow studies on their particular horse that they're riding, and nobody's going to read them. I mean,
it's worse than that, Walter. So what they do read are not the historian's interpretation of history, but Bill O'Reilly's Lincoln book. I'm sorry, but we have a responsibility. I take very seriously being at a state school or a state. I always want to teach in those public education places. Just how important it is, and part of it, I think, not only is history not being taught, so people learn how to write the history, but a lot of people aren't being taught to write. It breaks my heart, some of the papers I get today. I've got to wonder, am I going to spend all the time trying to teach them to write, or am I going to try to teach them history? Because they have not, at least they're coming to Clemson. I hope it's different at USC. They're coming to Clemson not very able to express themselves so that most people can understand. And Walter, I just want to say thank you. This is the way we get this information out. This is public history. No one has done more for South Carolina history than you have, and this program has been central to introducing people to the importance of history and the importance of how our history relates to democracy, and hopefully will continue to. So thank you. Thank you for this opportunity.
Well, thank you for that. But South Carolina has a wonderful but complicated history. And I'll make no bones about that.
Complicated is the right word.
Yeah.
Every place in the world has a complicated history.
I think as usual, South Carolina leads, Peter.
Peter, I'm sorry. I would put us with the...
We're first in succession, first in Civil War, first to challenge the vote, and first in complexity, Peter.
All right. Well, Peter Eisenstadt and Vernon Burton, I want to thank you both for coming down from Clemson to be with us today on The Journal. I hope you enjoyed our conversation today. I know that I did. In his Gettysburg Address, Abraham Lincoln promised that the nation's sacrifices during the Civil War would lead to a new birth of freedom. In my conversation with Vernon Burton and Peter Eisenstadt about the book, Lincoln's Unfinished Work, The New Birth of Freedom from Generation to Generation, we talked about some of the ways that the United States has attempted to realize that promise over the past century and a half, as well as ways our nation has tried to subvert it. Lincoln's Unfinished Work is still a work in progress.
Walter Edgar's Journal is a production of South Carolina Public Radio. I'm Alfred Turner, and I produce the show, which is made possible by listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. Remember that views and opinions expressed on Walter Edgar's Journal are not necessarily those of South Carolina Public Radio or its underwriters.
New episodes of Walter Edgar's Journal are published on the first and third Fridays of the month and are available at southcarolinapublicradio.org, on the SCETV app, as well as from your favorite podcast provider. We'll talk again soon.